you for inviting me here to speak on such an important issue at the moment. Can I just check that everyone can hear me okay if I speak at this level? Wave your hands if you don't, or if I go too fast or too slow, just give me a wave. So when we talk about the environmental or climate consequences of a conflict, this isn't to take away from the devastating humanitarian impacts. What I'd like to address today is the intrinsic link between the environmental damage and devastating humanitarian consequences. Now, the environmental impact of this conflict long predates the last 6 months. Israel's occupation of Palestine has for many years impacted the environment and the climate in numerous ways, including interrupting environmental policy enforcement. A report from the UN Environment Programme in 2020 highlighted that Palestinian policymakers and environmental professionals can't follow best practice solutions in environmental management because of the restrictions put in place by Israel on water and on land. And while this sounds like a relatively mundane or sort of technical issue to have, poor governance actually does have really devastating consequences. For example, these Israeli policies and the practices that Palestinians have created to adapt to them undermine the Palestinian resilience to the threats of climate change. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change predicts that the southern and eastern Mediterranean will warm at a higher rate than the global average over the 21st century, between 2.2 and 5.1 degrees, which will inevitably lead to highly disruptive, if not catastrophic, changes to the region's climate. Now, how vulnerable a nation is to climate change is determined by both a mix of the climate risk, but also adaptive readiness, meaning how ready a place is to respond to the impacts of climate change. Displacement, dispossession, oppression, and poor governance will all make an area, and as a result, the people within it, far more vulnerable to the impacts of climate crisis. The Palestinian Policy Network, Al-Shabaka, writes in their 2019 report that restrictions on the free movement of people and goods, the apartheid wall, land grabs, settlement expansion and settler violence, as well as poor governance, all threaten Palestinian water and food security and consequently increase climate change vulnerability. And to continue to build a picture of how intrinsically linked environmental impacts are with occupation and with war, I'm going to talk a little bit about water supplies, a resource which has been impacted by the occupation as well long before the past 6 months. Historically, Israel has controlled Palestinian access to water through the Joint Water Committee, which prohibits any water-related decision without Israeli approval. This means that developing new access to water or repairing infrastructure is extremely difficult because Israel grants very few permits and destroys any buildings and wells made without them. This includes things just like attempts to collect rainwater. As well, on average, Israeli settlers and soldiers attacked water supplies in the West Bank about 3 times a month between January 2022 and mid-2023. And meanwhile, Israeli settlers face no restrictions on their water use. This is a key example of where environmental impacts are intertwined with humanitarian impacts and human rights issues. And even before Israel's unlawful blockade of water into Gaza from October, the impacts of the occupation's disruption to water access has already been deadly. In 2016, 90 to 95% of the water in Gaza was estimated to be contaminated or unfit for drinking or irrigation. And in 2018, contaminated water accounted for more than 26% of all reported diseases in Gaza and was the leading cause of child mortality. Not only does environmental damage link to humanitarian risks and climate justice issues and human rights, but it also links to public health. Where water supply is limited, as is the ability to deal with waste and sewage. A report from UNICEF in February found that no wastewater treatments in Gaza are currently working. And as a result, sewage water has already flooded streets in Gaza, and when sewage systems are damaged, the chance of flooding is much higher. And when rain mixes with raw sewage, the risk to public health increases. In February, UNICEF again reported an increase in patients with flu and gastrointestinal diseases, and MSF also noted children suffering from skin rashes due to the lack of clean water for bathing and washing. And again, we see this humanitarian cost of weaponising the environment and how environmental health is key to public health. And this is before we've even begun to consider the impact of a sort of toxic mix of dust, ash and other sorts of carcinogens being inhaled by Palestinians in Gaza in the aftermath of the destruction of buildings. And I've already spoken about how the occupation and the war is impacting on Palestine's ability to respond to the climate crisis. But what about the war's contribution to the climate crisis? It's not difficult to tell watching the news or being on social media that Israel's attack on Gaza has been absolutely brutal, with a satellite analysis from January indicating that between 50 and 62% of all buildings have been damaged or destroyed by the IDF, a figure which will be undoubtedly higher now. Researchers have estimated that the first 60 days of Israel's bombardment of Gaza resulted in 281,000 metric tons of CO2 equivalent, which is roughly the same as 75 coal-fired power plants operating for about a year, and more greenhouse gas emissions than 20 climate vulnerable nations produce in a year. And this figure considers the emissions from the Israeli F-26 and F-35 fighter jets, as well as the climate impact of the bombs dropped on Gaza. And as a useful aside, it's worth pointing out that those F-35 fighter jets are made in the UK, up near Preston, where I'm from, near where I'm from, by unionised Unite workers. But yeah, I'll say before, I think there's a panel on defence diversification later, which is a really crucial cog of this element. But yes, this estimation also takes into consideration military aid flights, US, mostly arriving from the US, US delivering weapons to Israel, which accounts for half of these emissions. Other sources of emissions include things like tanks and ground vehicles, which are often highly sort of polluting because they use diesel, as well as rockets fired from Hamas into Israel, but this does account for like less than 1%, which goes to show the sort of imbalance of power going on here. And this figure that I said, this equivalent of 75 coal-fired power plants operating for a year, this is based on the first 60 days, and tomorrow will mark 190 days. And while the carbon footprint of warfighting itself is really significant, it's overshadowed by the scale of emissions caused by reconstructing the homes, hospitals and vital infrastructure that has been destroyed. Damaged and destroyed buildings will need to be rebuilt, and rebuilding means using cement and using steel, both of which are hugely carbon intensive to produce. A further estimate suggests that reconstructing Gaza will produce emissions equivalent to the annual output of New Zealand. And while these aren't emissions directly caused by warfighting itself, it's crucial that we consider the indirect costs of war that are often overlooked. Gaza would not need to be rebuilt if it was not currently being destroyed. Critically, these figures are estimations, and are likely an underestimation, if anything. But estimations are essential for us to understand the emissions caused by conflicts, since there is no other framework for reporting conflict emissions internationally. This means that there's no current system through which Israel will ever be held accountable for the emissions caused by this current bombardment. Now, Gaza is a region which has already seen temperature increases recently and is projected to see temperatures rise further. We know that the climate crisis is a problem for Gaza, but it's a problem for all of us. I'm sure I'm preaching to the converted here. Last year was the hottest year on record, and global efforts to reduce emissions and create a sustainable future for current and for future generations are being completely sidetracked by large-scale wars with no accountability for these emissions within the UN. We are inseparable from our environment. The air that we breathe, the water that we drink, and the soil that we grow our food in, and the weather patterns that will change regardless of whether we're ready for them or not. It's crucial that the environment is protected in war because we know the human cost when it is damaged. Accountability is key, and we need governments to be held accountable for the damage they cause during wars, and this can start with play a key role in this. As I mentioned, they have this direct connection to the military supply chain, as well as sort of political power. But this has to start with the membership, because pushing this forward as a priority. Because it's critical that when we talk about holding power to account for destruction, we consider the full scope of their atrocities, and this has to include environmental